Okay, so this is video number 2. Hopefully you were able to watch video number 1 without any problem. As I said to you, you could actually download video number 1 by putting SS before the YouTube URL, the URL, and that would mean that all the videos that I will be uploading will be on your computer, so you won't need the YouTube if you want to, or you want to sort of watch it again or something. That's up to you. If you remember from yesterday, we were doing the chapter 4, and we were going down the list, and it says how to study for chapter 4 for the test. I said to you that this is the macro test, of course, and macro is the largest topic in the units of study in the Cambridge syllabus. So for that reason, we need to make sure that everything is very clear, and you will find that these topics will link into a lot of other subjects that you will be covering further down the line, and therefore it's important that we understand all of it. Okay, so we went through vocabulary and graphs, and I said to you that it's really important for the exam to make sure that you use subject-specific vocabulary. I said to you that graphs are super important, particularly if you are looking to increase your mark from, let's say, a C to a B to an A. We talked about what macroeconomics really means, and why do we study it, and who needs to study it, and what type of jobs, such as the Minister of Finance, or maybe companies who want to look at the broader picture of a particular country that they're planning on investing, will need to understand macroeconomics. And of course, everybody else who reads a newspaper and is interested in world politics is certainly going to need to have some understanding of macroeconomics, because they're dealing with the topics like inflation, unemployment, exchange rates, etc., equity, which is the main topics in the newspapers and of political debate. And so we went on to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. We went on a little bit to briefly discuss inflation and balance of payments and exchange rates, and then terms of trade, then a quickie on international trade, and then finally we finished yesterday dealing with trade blocs such as NAFTA and the EU and even the ASEAN countries, which includes Vietnam. And that's where we ended. An interesting little story that I want to tell you is I was talking to my brother who lives in Canada, and he's a CEO of a big Canadian non-governmental organization which deals with development issues in other countries and Canada's aid programs, etc., etc. And you may be interested to hear that they had this big what we would call it a big conference where they had lots of representatives of international trade ministers from many countries in the less developed world, and they were going to invite Vietnam, but Canada today decided that, or not today, this is about a week ago, decided that Vietnam is no longer a less developed country. So it's considered one of those tiger economies with a fast-growing economy, and that they no longer need to be helped in the same way that many other countries, perhaps in Asia or in Africa or in Latin America, need this help. So that's a kind of interesting little tidbit of information, because we often think sometimes that maybe Vietnam is a poor country compared to other countries, when in fact it's obviously not the case, and that now looking at the statistics, particularly economic growth and GDP and international trade. Vietnam is one of those fast-growing tiger economies in the Asian world, and according to Canada, no longer needs to be helped. So I thought that was a kind of an interesting little tidbit of information to share with all of you. So I was just looking through the textbook. You should have the textbook in front of you, and you should basically be looking over everything that the chapter 4 has to offer. It's a long chapter where you're dealing with a fair amount of graphs, particularly the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graphs. We talked a bit about it yesterday, about how they operate in a fairly similar way to microeconomic supply and demand graphs, but don't forget you have to label it properly with the price level on the y-axis and the real GDP on the x-axis. And we learn a lot, particularly on page 83, where they start discussing the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is definitely something that you will have to be studying and analyze. And so you need to know, for example, why is it that the Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve is so different from the monetarist aggregate supply curve. Okay, so as I was saying, sorry to interrupt there, but you need to make sure, as in figure 4.5, that it is this is the Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve, and it looks that way because Keynesians do not accept the idea that increased amounts of aggregate demand will cause inflation. They see 99.9% of economic activity happening on the horizontal side of the long-run aggregate supply curve, and it's only in the sort of the curvature when it's moving up to the vertical side, which is in very, very rare circumstances, like in the 1970s, that you will have a situation where suddenly, because of a maybe an overheated economy, that there may be a tight labor force. In other words, there's going to be a little bit of a shortage of workers, and there's going to be maybe a shortage of land and a shortage of managerial skills and a shortage of machinery. It's difficult to imagine this situation, but it might happen, and this is how Keynesians view the world. And it's really quite fundamental to macroeconomics it's really fundamental in macroeconomics because it helps us to understand exactly why it is that the monetarists view inflation as being so important. On the other hand, you can see the other extreme, you might say, which is on the next page, which is page 84, figure 4.6, where you can see that the long-run aggregate supply curve from the monetarist perspective is a vertical line. And what is the significance of that? What does that tell us? Okay, so stop your YouTube video and write down in your notes, what does a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve tell us about how the monetarists view inflation? Okay, I'll give you 1 minute to do that. Okay, if you look on the next page, which is page 86, we get into the kind of serious topic of inflation. It is a really major part of chapter 4. We've done lots of work on it already. Some of you did a video presentation on the subject. We've talked about it in class. We've had debates about it, about the ways in which You can solve inflation either by the Keynesian strategy or the monitor strategy. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to take out the handout that I sent all of you, which has this inflation sort of logo on the front, and look at it. And we're just going to try to go over inflation today so that you feel rock solid understanding of the subject, which is really key for our understanding of macro at the AS level. In fact, unemployment is discussed a little bit, but in fact unemployment is more discussed in the A level than it is in the AS level. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to put more emphasis for chapter 4. We're going to put more onto inflation. So the definition is a sustained rise in the general price level, okay? And clearly this is important because a lot of people feel that if the price of hamburgers goes up, that this is an example of inflation, and it's not, okay? That is an example of prices going up for hamburgers at a particular restaurant. So we need to sort of consider the reality that this is a macro view of the economy, and it has to be a general look at all the prices, and if the average prices of goods and services in an economy has gone up, then that would be definitely considered to be an example of inflation. And the obvious question would be, how do you calculate this? And part of the answer is actually a reflection of the weakness of calculating inflation. So as we all know, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is done by the Ministry of Statistics in Vietnam, and it's also done in Canada and in most countries as well, they will get information from all over the country. As we know in calculus, that the more sources of information, the more amount of information that you have, the more accurate the results usually will be. And so for that reason, most governments will try to get as much information as possible from around the country, from as many sources as possible. So if they want to know what the price of bread is, they're not going to go just down to the local baker in Hanoi and say, okay, what's the price of bread? They will have people who will send a message to the Ministry of Statistics in their towns and villages and tell the government what is the price of bread for today. Now obviously bread is not the only goods and services that are calculated in inflation. The way that it is calculated is for a family of 4, and they have what they call a basket of goods where they estimate what would be the average amount of consumption by a family of 4. And this obviously leads to a lot of errors and miscalculations because, is your basket the same as my basket? Is your basket the same as a basket of a poor rice farmer in the Mekong Delta? No, I don't think it is. But you have to go from somewhere, and therefore they try to average it out both from urban living and rural living, and they try to put a package together as to what they think the average Vietnamese person actually consumes every month. So obviously you need to have include in that calculation things like rent, clothing, public transportation, etc., etc., food. And this is again, if you're including the cost of public transportation, obviously if you're a rich person who never takes public transportation, then the increased prices of public transportation are fairly meaningless. So for that reason, we have to reflect on how accurate these statistics really are. But since the government needs to have some statistics, they try to calculate it in terms of averaging it out and using what they call weighting, where not weighting as in W-A-I-T, but as in W-E-I-G-H-T, and they put more emphasis on certain things that are more fundamental to the average person's life. So for example, in Vietnam, most people eat rice. Not only do they eat rice, but they probably eat rice 3 times a day, and therefore if the price of rice went up, then clearly the weighting of rice needs to be increased. In other words, the importance of the rice increase needs to be somehow highlighted or underlined when calculating the level of inflation. And if the price of business class tickets from Hanoi to New York went up, then maybe that's a concern to some people, but you would probably find that not that many people fly on a regular basis from Hanoi to New York, and therefore the weighting for that product or service would probably be lowered because it's not all that significant in the average family's budget. So we also emphasize this whole idea that inflation actually causes a fall in purchasing power. In other words, people actually are able to purchase less as inflation goes up, and this is obviously concerning, particularly if you are a business owner or even if you're a Keynesian politician who is trying to increase consumption as a way of stimulating economic growth. They will be particularly frustrated if there is a high level of inflation. Now, there's no doubt about it that monetarists view inflation much more seriously than Keynesians, okay? Myself being, I suppose, a Keynesian, I would say that inflation is not as life and death as something like unemployment, because unemployment usually affects dramatically the level of poverty and issues about equity, etc., etc. But there's no doubt about it that the monetarist argument about inflation is also valid. Everybody suffers from inflation, okay? If you have inflation, we are all consumers, and therefore we will all have our purchasing power reduced. And for that reason, it's particularly important not only to control inflation, to get it under control, but also to calculate it in an effective manner so that people know what the true rate of inflation really is, which is we call in English a misnomer, which is a fancy way of saying, it's a kind of a weird way to put it, because there is no way to accurately measure inflation. There is a fairly broad estimate where governments try to use this information, sometimes for their own political benefit. I know that in Canada, if the inflation rate is particularly high, then the government that is in power tries to somehow trivialize inflation, say, oh, it's not that important. The things that we are doing in government, those are a lot more important. But you may find that consumers will disagree, and for that reason they will throw them out at the next election. But certainly inflation is something that has to be maybe one or maybe the second most important macroeconomic issue that we are going to be analyzing, and is emphasized in this chapter. They bring up a number of vocabulary words, things like hyperinflation, deflation, disinflation, cost push inflation, demand pull inflation, the CPI, RPI, accelerating inflation, stagflation, and unanticipated inflation. So quickly speaking, hyperinflation is really very, very serious. This is something that takes place occasionally. It's taken place in countries like Israel and Zimbabwe and in Argentina. Many Latin American countries often didn't really have a handle on the rate of inflation, and for that reason, the inflation rate just suddenly spiraled out of control. And sometimes that happens because governments have had very either unwise or ignorant strategies to solve the inflation. I know for a fact, having lived in Zimbabwe for 5 years, that in Zimbabwe, when they started suffering from inflation, what did they do? They said, hey, no problem, let's print more money. So when the teachers decided that they were suffering because inflation was so high and they went out on strike, they wanted the teachers to go back to work, and so they said, okay, we'll give you some more money. So they kind of instructed the mint, which is, the mint is the side of government that prints the money. They have the machines where they go out and they tell the machines to work a bit faster, and before you know it, they're printing a lot more money and they pay the teachers. And then the teachers are all happy, they go back to work, and before you know it, inflation actually gets worse. And then somebody else goes out on strike, maybe the nurses or somebody else, the road cleaners or something, and before you know it, the government is saying, hey, it worked last time, let's do a bit of QE again, quantitative easing, print a bit more money, and before you know it, they think they've solved the problem, but they haven't. And then they solve the problem in the short term, but that causes too many people chasing too few goods, and before you know it, you've got things really, really out of control. What can you do about it? Okay, now in situations like hyperinflation, you're going to find that Keynesians and monitors are probably going to get together and agree that they need to have some form of what they call contractionary monetary policy, which means that they are going to do everything they can to withdraw money out of the circular flow. They're going to try to slow down the velocity of the circular flow. Now, usually that's just the job of the monetarists, but in fact, the Keynesians are going to be doing it just as hard, because if you're dealing with a 500,000 or 1,000,000% inflation where prices are doubling every day, you know that basically, your economy is at risk, even the security of your country is at risk, and you have to do really radical things. We have seen through history, such as in pre-war Germany during the 1930s, that inflation got totally out of control, and many people have argued that inflation was one of the major causes for the Germans' attraction to Nazism and Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler used the insecurity of the German mark going down and devaluing on a daily basis as something to underline his political values. And a lot of people who probably normally would never be sympathetic to that believe that finally we have somebody who's doing something. They didn't know if it was going to work or not, but people who had maybe a bit of savings for their retirement, maybe they had, let's say, $100,000 in savings for their retirement, which was a lot of money in those days, would suddenly discover that the money that they had spent all their life trying to save has suddenly now been able to buy a newspaper or something as ridiculous as that. And so people were incredibly angry. And when people are incredibly angry, they will do crazy things like support the Nazis. And 50 million people died in World War II, 28 million Soviets died during that time. Clearly, this was a total disaster in the world. And some people, some economic historians, have blamed inflation as one of the key factors as to why people take up extreme policies when they feel scared. They basically feel scared, they feel insecure. Deflation is basically when the inflation rate goes down, and I think we've talked about this before. It doesn't happen that often, but it's definitely happening in Japan. Japan has gone through about 2 decades of recession, or really it's a depression. We don't use the word depression very often anymore, because people jump out of buildings or jump off of bridges when they hear the word depression. But the Japanese have basically had a very slow, undynamic economy. The value of their yen has been so high that nobody wants to buy a Japanese car anymore. The Japanese economy is based on exports. It is an export-driven economy. Nobody really wants to buy the Japanese products because they're too expensive. Everybody wants to buy either Chinese or Vietnamese or Korean products, and the quality of Vietnamese and Korean and Chinese products are more or less the same now as they are in Japan, partly due to mechanization and robots. We call that robotization. And so clearly the Japanese have found themselves in a situation where their economy has kind of gone down the tubes. And what that has meant, because economic growth has been very slow or non-existent, is that prices start going down. Now, you would think that if the prices are going down, that everybody would celebrate, because it means that purchasing power is actually going up. But unfortunately, we discover very quickly that when there is an example of deflation, the economy is usually really, really bad. There are not a lot of jobs, there's high unemployment, there's a lot of stagnation in the economy, and for that reason, deflation is considered to be undesirable just almost as much as inflation. So the desired amount of inflation, and this is an interesting topic, because you would think that zero inflation is actually the most desirable. A lot of economists feel that if there's 1 or 2% of inflation, this is an indication of a truly dynamic economy that's moving up the ladder, that's growing, that's doing well, etc., etc. I'm not too sure if I agree, but that's probably what the Cambridge examiners are looking for you to say, so maybe you should say that. Disinflation certainly is just the process of moving down. The inflation is actually moving down. Cost push and demand pull, we've talked about this quite a bit. Cost push is usually used by Keynesians that want to imply that inflation has been caused by the increased prices for factors of production, inputs, in other words, things like oil or maybe parts for cars. If you're building cars and you're importing these parts from other countries, and the other countries are raising their prices, then you really don't have much choice but to also raise the price of the finished good. So this is actually an example of cost push inflation. In my opinion, even though being a Keynesian myself, I kind of feel that it's a very weak attempt by Keynesians to dismiss any responsibility for economic failure with inflation, because they're just saying, well, it's not really our fault, it's the fault of foreigners, which obviously is a dangerous trend because it can promote a certain amount of xenophobia, the idea that we're okay, but it's the other guys, the people who live outside of our country, that are really destabilizing our economy. Demand pull inflation, of course, is reflected by monetarists who basically believe that there are too many people chasing too few goods, and that we should not be trying to increase aggregate demand. We should not be trying to increase the velocity of the circular flow. So for that reason, monetarists who usually use this demand pull inflation theory, they're the ones who are going to tell you, oh, no, it's got nothing to do with import costs, like the Keynesians are saying. It's only because there's just too much demand, and this is actually causing inflation. Now, I want you to stop the YouTube video here for a minute, and I want you, on your exercise book, or on your piece of paper that you have in front of you, I want you to draw me a demand pull inflation graph, and I want you to draw me a cost push inflation graph. You should have it correct. Okay, so now you've got CPI, RPI. We know what CPI is. Retail price index is really kind of like an indicator that is for prices going up in the factories, and that is really only useful for future calculations of inflation. So if you're kind of an economist who wants to predict, maybe you're an econometrician who studies econometrics, which is mathematical modeling for the purpose of prediction, then you definitely would be using the RPI, because you don't just want to know what the inflation rate is today, you want to know what it is in a year's time so that you can advise governments on what they should do, etc. Accelerating inflation obviously means that the rate of inflation is going up, and maybe it will end up being a hyperinflation, so therefore you've got to do something quick in order to stop the rise in inflation. Stagflation is a double whammy for a lot of less developed countries where you have high unemployment and high inflation. A lot of monetarists believe that that's usually not possible, which of course is a fallacy. I mean, they've obviously not lived in many different countries before, but in many countries which are struggling to survive, people are suffering from unemployment because of the high inflation, and they're suffering from high inflation because of the rate of unemployment, and therefore it's a vicious circle, a vicious cycle, I should say. And on the test, really all you need to know is what is stagflation, a combination of high inflation and high unemployment. And then there's the unanticipated inflation. This is something that is fairly significant because a lot of the inflation is sometimes calculated in terms of a psychological inflation. In other words, if the people think that inflation will go up, then it really will. That people will adjust their financial business in a way which says, okay, if the inflation rate was 20% last month, it probably will be 20% this month, and for that reason we need to make arrangements to protect ourselves. And if you do that, it becomes what they call a self-fulfilling prophecy, where basically you will get what you have feared the most, which is another 20% rate of inflation. So this is something which is when things are anticipated or unanticipated, basically means that whether people expected it to be an inflationary month or an inflationary year, or did they not. Okay, we've done the paragraph about the CPI, and I think we need to go on to the last paragraph of the first page. They're dealing with weighting. Okay, I talked about that a little bit in the first video. It says that a price index only measures inflation for average households. It also cannot take into account changes in the quality and distribution of goods over time. Due to the fact that food was more essential than changes in the price of, say, tobacco, this is because a larger proportion of total household income is spent on food than on tobacco. Therefore, the figures have to be weighted before the final index can be calculated. For example, assume that there are only two goods in the economy, food and cars. Households spend 75% of their income on food and 25% on cars. There is an increase in the price of food of 8% and of cars of 4% over 1 year. In a normal average calculation, the 8 and the 4 would be added together and therefore divided by 2 to arrive at an average price increase of 6%. However, this provides an inaccurate calculation because spending on food is more important in the household budget than spending on cars. I would assume that to be true. Therefore, the figures have to be weighted. Okay, so in other words, weighting in the consumer price index really has a lot to do with putting greater importance on products and services which are more used in a family. We talked about demand pull and cost push already. Consumer spending may rise due to a low interest rate, encouraging greater use by credit cards. Sometimes consumer confidence could be rising due to positive signals by government that the economy is doing well. This is something I talked about, the psychological aspect of inflation, that people in their minds think that, oh, well, things are doing really well, therefore we can spend more money. And this may actually, cause a certain amount of damage to the economy because of inflation. This increase in demand could be encouraged by increased investment by firms that are trying to take advantage of the greater velocity of the circular flow of money. Okay, companies are trying to increase productive capacity to take advantage of consumers having more money. We talked about this all the time. Remember, it's the economies of scale graph, but more like a macro economies of scale graph, where you find that companies are trying to increase their level of production to take advantage of their the greater increase of money held by consumers, and therefore these companies are able to cut costs through economies of scale, and therefore prices could actually go down. And so this is one of the strategies that many governments use to try to reduce the rate of inflation. Also, governments may be increasing their spending to fulfill political promises, or that government may have cut taxes, which stimulates aggregate demand. On the other hand, demand pull inflation may also be caused by growth of the money supply, okay? And this is usually controlled by the central bank. The central bank is controlled really by the government. The governor of the central bank, or in the United States they call it the Federal Reserve, but in most countries like in Canada and Vietnam we call it the central bank. And usually the governor of the central bank is an appointee, we could say, of the government, and therefore they have to kind of follow government instructions. And therefore when the government decides to, let's say, reduce the discount rate, okay, the discount rate is the interest rate which the central bank lends money to commercial banks, then this will obviously make it easier for consumers to borrow money and to get the economy moving again. And this could actually be a sort of a strategy of the government. It says it right here: central banks through the discount rate can stimulate demand by lending more money at lower interest rates to commercial banks, who make that money available to consumers to borrow. So these are a number of the strategies that governments have on their fingertips, and that they are able to use when they feel that inflation is either out of control or is in danger in the future or whatever. We've talked a bit about cost push inflation. I don't think we need to talk about that. A past exam question: what are the costs to the economy of sustained high inflation? Okay, well, that's a really good question, and these are some of the answers that you could deal with. Economic growth and employment. This is a cost. I mean, if you have low economic growth and low employment, that's obviously bad for the economy. Your export competitiveness is decreased, which may cause the loss of jobs and growth. Something which is kind of interesting is the equity costs. I've never thought about this so much, but it's quite possible that anyone on a fixed income, such as pensioners, will be less equal, and that's obvious when you think about it, that they will be less equal, and therefore they will be suffering, and they will be suffering more than if you were employed where you were getting an inflationary bonus every year, maybe every 12 months. Political costs. Inflation is highly unpopular by the electorate. Something which I don't know to what extent is super important, but they mention it in the syllabus. They talk about shoe leather costs, which is really the consumers shopping around for best prices, which sometimes is used as being very wasteful of energy and resources. Moderately high rates of inflation erodes the value of cash, assuming that the interest rate is still higher than the rate of inflation. So whenever you have a situation that sort of consumers are kind of wasting their time and energy looking for lower prices because they think that there's a wide disparity in the prices in the markets, then this could actually cause an increase in what they call shoe leather costs. And then finally, menu costs, which I think is a little bit funny, where they talk about how menus have to be changed by restaurants, and vending machines have to be adjusted. That before you could get a chocolate bar for maybe 10,000 dong, and now you have to pay 20,000 dong, and that therefore the machines need to be changed or adjusted to require more money. And therefore it's it's an extra cost on the vending machine companies. And even they talk about parking meters, but I don't ever remember seeing a parking meter in Vietnam. But basically a parking meter is a little sort of a money box next to a lot of parking spaces in the center of big cities, and you're supposed to stick in money depending on how long you're planning to stay in that spot. And there'll be a parking meter person who will go around checking to see if the parking meters have been expired, and if they are expired, you will get a fine, you'll get a ticket, and they will charge you money. And therefore, obviously, these parking meters have to be changed if, in fact, the price of, let's say it was costing 25 cents, if you're talking about Canadian money, and now it's going to cost 50 cents, then probably you're going to have to adjust the parking meter, if you're staying for 1 hour in the parking. So I thought that was a kind of an interesting example. As I said in the end here about Japan, about deflation, and how deflation is really quite serious in Japan. You would think that people would be celebrating, but it's not the case. That it's usually a reflection of a very recessionary or depressionary economy. A recession is basically an economy that has a zero or negative economic growth over a period of 2 financial quarters. Okay, so a financial quarter is 3 months. So 2 financial quarters is 6 months. So if you have zero or negative economic growth for 6 months, then you are suffering from a recession. If it's more than 6 months, then you are suffering from a depression. But for reasons that I don't quite understand, but they say it's a psychological game that governments are playing with, they almost never use the D word. Okay, the D word being depression, because they think that this will cause a psychological effect on people, and they will not spend their money. They're going to start, hiding or jumping out of bridges or jumping off bridges. And for that reason, they just say a long recession, because a recession is actually not such a psychologically damaging word. But maybe because of the Great Depression during the 1930s, that the word depression obviously got a really bad reputation, and people don't like using the word. They see it almost like a swear word or a bad word that you should never really use. If you turn the page, then you can see that it's just basically dealing with how governments try to deal with inflation, we're talking a little bit about how central banks try to deal with it. Central banks have a certain amount of authority in order to change the interest rates, and if the interest rates are, let's say, lower, then usually the commercial banks will lower the interest rates as well. So there's like a knock-on effect. There's also a lot of general disagreement between, to what extent inflation has a critical impact on the economy. Obviously, monetarists see this as being, ultimately the most crucial macroeconomic indicator, while socialist demand-side economists and Keynesians will argue that inflation is imported and therefore not so important. Marxists, in fact, on the other hand, they argue that prices need to be controlled by the government to ensure stability in the pricing of basic commodities like staple food, housing, healthcare, and public transportation. So in some ways, Marxist economists tend to almost step out of the main argument about inflation, because they say, well, really, the government should be the provider of, let's say, public housing, and you would have the ability as the government just not to increase the price of public housing, ever, really, or very, very rarely. I remember reading stories when I was young that in Moscow, in the public housing estates in Moscow, that the price for rent had not changed in 30 years, and that people were having incredibly inexpensive housing because the government were the ones who were actually producing the housing. They were the ones who were setting the prices of housing, and that they were renting the housing, and therefore they had no need, because they weren't looking for a profit. Their objective was to provide a service to the public, and for that reason, inflation really never sort of took hold, certainly in the Moscow housing sort of sectors. You had things like bread. Bread in Moscow in the 1970s and 80s was about 5 kopecks, which is a tiny amount of money. So bread was almost free. And public transportation, I remember I went to Moscow a long time ago myself. This was during Soviet times. And I got onto a bus, and you didn't show, you didn't pay the bus driver or show a card to the bus driver. You showed it to the passengers, and the passengers kind of nodded their head to say, to nod agreement that you had a card and that you were not cheating the bus system. So really what the state was trying to do was to try to get the public to police the public, which is a really kind of original idea on how to run a public transportation system. I even remember being in some of the restaurants in Moscow where you would go and there would only be one thing on the menu, and that one thing might be, I don't know, spaghetti and meat sauce, and it was incredibly, incredibly cheap, but you only had one product, and you would get there and you would have your meal, they would serve it really, really quickly, you would finish it and you would go. And if you didn't want to have spaghetti and meatballs or whatever, you would go to a different restaurant and they would serve you something different. And so this is kind of little tidbits of examples of where, some countries are trying to control inflation by the government controlling the production, distribution, and exchange of fundamental products like public transportation or food or whatever, housing. Okay. At the end, okay, there are 2 questions that I want you to answer. Okay, you should have already been thinking about this already. Explain the different ways in which both hyperinflation and deflation can damage an economy, illustrating your answer with examples from your own knowledge. Are there easy solutions for either macro problem? Well, okay, well, I'm not going to give you the answer because I want you to write them down. I want you to write like a mini essay here to answer this question. And certainly I would probably say no for both hyperinflation and deflation. Hyperinflation is probably the more dramatic problem because hyperinflation can destroy your whole society. As a really good example, Zimbabwe, where I lived, as I said to you before, for 5 years, they decided to abolish their own money because of hyperinflation. So you can imagine that the government decided that this was an ultimate security issue, and they decided that the inflation rate was so high that it had the potential to destroy all of society. And so for that reason, they decided just to abolish the currency. And so therefore, if you were going to be paid something, you would be paid in foreign currency. So suddenly teachers were paid in US dollars, and you would buy your groceries in either rand, the South African rand, or US dollars. And people survived for, I think it was about 5 or 6 years using alternative currencies. And I've heard from a friend who's teaching at the international school in Harare in Zimbabwe that they have introduced a new Zimbabwe currency, but it's not very popular. A lot of people are very suspect of the currency, and for that reason, you know, it may not actually take off. So, you know, what is the alternative? So clearly, this would be a good lesson for governments to take a hard line on some businesses that accept foreign currency as payment, because the moment that happens, then suddenly when the citizens of the country lose faith in their own currency, then you have a one-way direction down in terms of your economy. And I've experienced it myself. I've actually gone to, you know, shops where, you know, they have asked for foreign currency, and I've told them, no, I only have Vietnam dong. I was considering buying a house in Vietnam, and they wanted the money in foreign currency, and so I said that that's not a good idea. And it's always dangerous because, first of all, it's illegal, but it's also very unhelpful to the economy, and you could actually cause the economy a lot of damage. So if you love your country, then the last thing you want to do is to damage your economy, and paying with a foreign currency is not a good idea. Particularly since the Vietnamese government has done such a good job in stabilizing the Vietnam dong. As I said to you before, the Vietnam dong is now at the same price that it was 4 years ago when I first came to Ho Chi Minh in 2016. Now it's 2020, and it's the same exchange rate. So there is no benefit to you to be hanging on to your foreign currency or paying in foreign currency. The government has done their best to stabilize the Vietnam dong. We need to step up and show a little bit of loyalty to our country, and that we should only be paying in Vietnam dong. So that is what I'm going to talk about today. The final question is, are inflation indices valid? Okay, and that's actually quite a good question. There's a lot of debate on it, and I've talked to you a little bit about it already. I want you to write another essay on this topic, and I want you to give me examples and graphs and all sorts of things, and look it up. I mean, look it up not only in your textbook, but maybe even on Google. Some of the problems of things like the consumer price index, or the retail price index. What are some of the problems? And I said to you already that that your basket of goods may be different from mine. So that's the direction that I'm trying to look at. So if we are using something like the CPI to calculate inflation, and in your opinion the inflation rate is not very accurate, that it's only reflecting what the government wants you to see, then what is the alternative? Maybe you can create a new a new index for calculating inflation, and that would be kind of fun to sort of create your own original inflation index. We can call it the Chu Van An inflation index, and explain it to me and how it would work. So basically tell me, you know, are inflation indices valid? You know the 4-paragraph strategy of answering questions. You explain what is an inflation index, first of all, then you sort of agree with this question for paragraph 2 and say, yes, inflation indexes are really valid, and you tell me all about the indexes that are available. And then paragraphs 3, you say, oh, no. On the other hand, this is not a good idea, and it's not very valid, and it's not very accurate, and it's only there to support the government, And then finally, in your 4th paragraph, kind of bring it all together and use your own examples, things that you've noticed in your life, or things that maybe you've noticed in the newspapers, and give me a bit of a graph if you could, and you're going to get a really, really good mark on these 2 essays. Okay, so I'm going to finish here. Hopefully it wasn't too long for you, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.